So again, thank you all for attending. My name is Travis Sandusky. I work for SaskPower. I'm on the small modular reactor development project. I'm going to be moderating today for you. This is our second session in this Power Talk series. Last week we were joined by some experts from across the nuclear industry, and we chatted about what your top questions specific to the nuclear industry were. Next week or tomorrow, actually, we're going to be chatting about large-scale renewables, and next week we're going to be taking a closer look at different supply options. Today, we're going to continue that nuclear-related discussion. We're going to focus it around our SaskPower's SMR development project. So with me today, I have Darcy Holderness. He's our project manager. He's responsible for the SMR development project team. He'll give you a bit of an update on the status of the project and where it's going. And we also have with Sarah Klein Bentley. She's our siting lead. And so a lot of our discussions today are going to focus around the progress we've made on siting to date. And so she'll walk us through a bit of an update and where we're at there. We have about 90 minutes together this afternoon. I'm going to launch a couple polls so you folks have an option to participate with us. Sarah and Darcy, like I said, are going to give you a bit of an update, share some slides, walk you through where we're at in the project. And we saved about half our time to go through what's on the top of your mind specific to this project. So we got lots of time for specific questions and answers. Okay, let's make sure my slides are advancing. Looks like I'm on our land acknowledgement now. SaskPower's work reaches the ancestral lands of many nations. As a Crown utility, we reaffirm our relationship with the peoples of these lands and our shared determination to preserve the lands for generations to come. Over this past month-ish, myself and a number of our team members on the project, including Darcy and Sarah, we've had an opportunity to spend time on treaties 2, 4, and 6, largely where we're looking at and focusing those siting areas and homeland of the Métis. I enjoy doing webinar style formats as it's an opportunity for us to open the doors and spend some time with folks across the province and on many different ancestral lands. And so I'd like to again just welcome you all here today. So I mentioned we're gonna have some opportunities for you guys to ask questions and answers. The webinar style format we have open today, there are 2 ways you can communicate with us. The first one's through the chat box. Myself and our panelists, we're not going to be monitoring the chat function for questions and answers, but we do have someone on the back end watching the chat function for technical difficulties. So if you're struggling to get into the poll or ask a question or something like that, open up the chat box just by clicking on that chat button there. A new window should open up if you're in the Zoom webinar. You can type your question in there, and someone will help you out with those technical difficulties. Project specific questions and answers, the ones I'm going to be queuing up for Darcy and Sarah. Try to send them to us through that Q&A function. So Q&A, same thing. You'll find that Q&A box. When you click it, a new pop-up box should appear. Those questions come to us on the back end here, and we'll have some folks answering questions directly, and we'll queue a bunch up to answer live. And so if you have questions around the projects, that's how you're going to get them to us. Okay, so I mentioned we're going to launch a few polls throughout today, so we can have some interactivity on this webinar. It's not just us speaking at you. To test that out and get you comfortable with it, we're going to launch one now. Our first poll is just about have you engaged with us so far, and so you should have a poll opening up on your screen now with these check boxes. This is a select all that apply poll, so we want to know what SMR project touch points you've had with us. Is this just your first event? Did you have an opportunity to see us in person at something? When we first made that siting announcement back in September, we had a bunch of webinars. So number 4, that we had a bunch of webinars. Some were specific to municipalities and their leaders. Some were public. Some were for Indigenous communities. We had some virtual learning events similar to this, last fall. They were around nuclear power. Some were around, our grid in itself. And so if you participate in that, let us know. We've also had we launched an online engagement hub. It's something that's fairly new for SaskPower. It's a virtual space for you to interact with us. So it's at that saskpower.com/engage. You could ask questions there. You could drop a pin on a map. You could participate in polls and things right in there. So if you've been participating in that, let us know. Or if you went to that virtual open house we had on the file early, again, I'd be immensely curious to see who we're reaching and through what formats. Okay. Now, test on my side. Do I get to see the results of that that poll? That's a good question. Aha. Okay, so poll results are in. It looks like we've had about almost half of you. This is your first event, and so Darcy, maybe keep that in the back of your mind when you're setting the table for the project. We did design the slide deck a little bit as a continuation of some of the other discussions we've had, and so we may have to take half a step back and recognize that this is the first event for 44%, almost half the folks in the room today. But we have had 30% of the folks attended one of the virtual online learnings. We've had over 40% of people attend a webinar previously. A large number of folks did one of our online surveys. We launched some surveys earlier. I think our last one was around the water value. So I'm really happy to see all these different tactics that we're using to try to reach people. That people are participating. So thanks for indulging me in the poll and for following the project along. All right, let's hop over to the future power supply. Darcy, I'm going to turn the floor right over to you, and if I'm going too fast or slow on the slides, you just let me know.
Yeah, no, sounds good. We'll go through an update of where we're at just with electricity production in Saskatchewan, and then run through an update on the project, and then get to the really exciting stuff, which is all of Sarah's slides on siting and where we're at with that important pathway on the project. So today we're about a 5,000 megawatt grid, and this is roughly where that energy comes from. So hydro it's regional Saskatchewan-based hydro. It's 20% or about 1/5. So that's about 1,000 megawatts of electricity we get from our hydro facilities. We have a growing amount of renewables on the grid today. If this was up a few years ago, it would have been about 5 or 6%, and we recently doubled that to 12. And we have a very aggressive plan to deploy a lot more renewables as we move through the 2020s and into the 2030s. But we're still heavily reliant on fossil fuels today. So you can see natural gas and conventional coal is still about 2/3 of our grid, or about 3,500 megawatts today. And that poses a challenge with emissions. We are a high emitting energy provider in Canada, one of the highest. And that's a challenge for us. We have to look for cleaner ways of producing energy. And so we have to think about how we can transition away from conventional use of fossil fuels and look for cleaner ways of producing electricity. And that's really what the SMR project represents for Saskatchewan. Next slide. So when you think about the future, we not only have to transition a lot of our conventional ways of producing electricity, we also have to think about electrification and demand increases and other industries looking to electrify to help them decarbonize. It is generally accepted that we have to reduce our emissions. Our customers are requiring us to. Our large industrial customers are asking us to lower our emissions profile. We have federal regulations that are requiring the shutdown of conventional ways of producing electricity. And we're starting to see those end of life for those technologies in the near future. 2030 is a big date for us. It's the retirement, or it's the federally mandated retirement of conventional coal for electricity production. And so that 24% of our grid has to be shut down by 2030. So we're building out a gas fleet right now to help support that transition. We're looking at imports, we're expanding renewables. All of those things are going to be required as we transition away from that conventional coal. Carbon capture and storage has may be an opportunity to extend the life of some of our fossil assets, and even with the natural gas fleet that we operate today and then are expanding to transition from coal, carbon capture and storage may be a technology that helps expand the life of those assets. But when we're thinking net zero, conventional natural gas doesn't fit the mold either. So you need carbon capture on it or something to reduce the emissions. So imports could be a part of that. Nuclear power you're going to see as an option for about the mid 2030s. This first project we're putting together, that's about the time it could hit the grid. And then it's managing an expansion of all the other options as well. So we don't have a lot of regional based hydro we can expand on in the province. There may be some opportunity there, but not too much. Wind and solar are going to be aggressively deployed in the province. They make a lot of sense to put as much of their cost-effective ways of producing power. And we'll put as much of those on the grid as we can while maintaining the grid in a reliable and sustainable manner and understanding the limitations of those renewables. Energy storage is going to be a huge part of the grid into the future. We're demonstrating a battery project just outside of Regina right now. And when you think about pairing technologies with renewables, energy storage is going to have to be required to wean ourselves away from natural gas at some point in the future. Geothermal is another big one. But we can go to the next slide. So there's a big initiative as we transition and think about the expansion of our electricity system in the province. We have a big initiative to engage on this, and we're looking for as much feedback from our stakeholders, Indigenous, the public, our customers, all stakeholders that live, work, and play in Saskatchewan. We'd like to hear from them in terms of finding the right balance of energy sources and understanding the values that are important to our customers, so that we can represent that in the decisions as we transition and move towards net zero futures. So saskpower.com/engage has a lot of information on the future of power, different supply scenarios. I know the next Power Talk series is major renewables integration into the grid and how that works and some of the principles behind it. So we're really encouraging everyone to stay up to speed, engage with us, and provide your comments and feedback through these avenues so that we are making well-informed decisions. Next slide. So we're here to run through the SMR development project, though, and small modular reactors and what they represent as a technology and an option for us in terms of clean electricity production for Saskatchewan. So at the next slide, I think just what is a small modular reactor? The small really speaks to the electrical output, and the industry defines that as about 50 to 300 megawatts per unit or per reactor. Conventional nuclear reactors that exist and operate today in Canada and North America are all in the large category. So these are 800, 900, 1,000 megawatts per single reactor, and it really makes it tough to tie a unit that size into our grid. So SMRs are changing the feasibility for nuclear power and really make it economical for grids that are our size. Modular, it speaks to the design. So it's how the reactor, the technology, and the power plants are designed so that a lot of the components can be built off-site in a shop environment. And that helps reduce some of the risk around construction schedule and cost overruns. Nuclear projects are very capital intense, and a lot of your success with the cost of energy from the facility depends on how successful you are through the construction phase. So the modular aspect is meant to manage that risk and help manage it and reduce it. It's not to say this technology is come and offloaded from a truck and plugged into the grid. It's still a mega construction project. It's a multi-billion-dollar. We've allowed for about 4 years for construction and commissioning. And so significant effort needs to go into the planning to ensure success in that construction aspect. And then reactor, it just speaks to where we get the thermal energy. The principle for nuclear fission with SMRs are the exact same as conventional reactors. And the theory of producing the heat along with a lot of radioactivity radioactive energy is the same. And so these SMRs are regulated the exact same way as large conventional nuclear power plants are. They're all what's known as Class 1A nuclear facilities in Canada. Next slide. So technology, we've been looking at the SMR since the early 2010s in terms of feasibility and what options are out there, and looking at technology readiness and how they might fit for our business purpose in Saskatchewan. And in 2017, we started a 4-year formal process to evaluate technology readiness and select the most ideal technology for Saskatchewan, deployable in the time frame that we were looking at deploying it. And we ended up on this GE Hitachi reactor. It's the BWRX-300. So that's boiling water reactor, and the X represents that it's the 10th generation of its kind. So it's based off of a boiling water reactor design that operates very widely in North America today, all in the US, at the conventional side. And so those principles of operation, maintenance, and safety are demonstrated at the large reactor scale. And the BWRX-300 really just brings the size down to that 300 megawatt range, the SMR range. So this GE Hitachi design, it's a US based design, and we'll be importing that design for use in Canada. We looked at it in close partnership with Ontario Power Generation, OPG, which is one of North America's largest nuclear operating companies, definitely the biggest in Canada. And so they're deploying the exact same technology in Ontario right before us. Now you can see the Canada Post vehicle in front of the building there, and this would be Lake Ontario in the background, just to give you a sense of the size. And they have a site that is already licensed for deployment of new nuclear, and they have broken ground to start developing and preparing that site for a nuclear reactor, and with the intention of deploying this exact concept design. So nuclear power, these are kind of the opportunities that it presents for us. This is energy that's available 24/7. So we consider nuclear power and SMR technology base load electricity option for Saskatchewan. So it has very high reliability factors and very high capacity factors associated with operation. It meets that reliability standpoint. Emissions free, there are no GHG emissions associated with operation of the facility. You can look at the carbon footprint over the life cycle of construction and transportation and that type of thing. And lots of studies are out there to compare different options on that front. And nuclear power on a per energy basis, because it's such a dense form of energy, you get more energy for CO2 emissions on a per unit of energy basis than any other technology out there. It's comparable with wind. Most studies have it just a little bit lower than wind and lower than solar. In terms of carbon footprint, it doesn't get much better than nuclear power. The right size for a grid, we've talked about the 300 megawatts fits into our grid easily, and we're building off of our resource we have here. We are home to very high grade uranium, and we export that uranium internationally, and we use it for domestic power reactors in Canada as well. And we're building off that resource. There's a lot of socioeconomic benefits with this type of technology. We have to invest in people. We have to invest in our infrastructure to show that we can safely and securely manage this technology and operate it here in Saskatchewan. There's a lot of investment along those lines that comes with this type of technology. And that's not to say there aren't challenges. We'll get into this with the next slide. The three big challenges with nuclear power are safety and waste and cost. And really, safety and waste amount to extra cost. This is large overnight capital. There's a large price tag associated with the construction of these reactors. But as long as you can amortize that over a long life, and these reactors are expected to operate reliably for 60 years after the first build. And that really, it speaks to how much energy you get out of the fuel. You get a large bang for the buck, so to say, and when you stretch that capital cost over a long life, and you include all of the safety systems, all of the investment in people and the infrastructure to keep the operation safe, and you account for waste management, it's still an economic form of electricity. I think the next slide will get into the waste a little bit. So waste is a very important part of managing a nuclear project, and we're developing long-term plans to manage our waste on site. Canada today, all nuclear byproducts are very safely tracked and stored. It's a very heavily regulated part of a nuclear power operation. About 90% of all the waste that's produced is considered low level waste. And so this is stuff like PPE, gloves, coveralls, paper products, things that have been exposed to some amount of contamination, but it's not too dangerous, so to say. And that you can sort it into categories, and some of that will decay in a very reasonable period of time and then can be treated as regular landfill waste. Some of it you could do different processing techniques, like we heard from New Brunswick Power. They incinerate a lot of their low-level waste, and then it reduces the volume to a much more smaller size that way. Intermediate level waste are used reactor parts. So these are things that have been in the main area of the reactor, and been exposed to radiation for a long period of time, and will stay radioactive and require shielding to protect people in the environment for a long period of time. And that's what's known as intermediate level waste. And then the high level, the used fuel, it all falls into the high level category of nuclear waste. And will stay dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years and require a lot of infrastructure to keep people and the environment safe. But the volume is quite low. So used nuclear fuel coming out of our reactors over a 60-year life for a 300 megawatt reactor, all the used nuclear fuel could fit inside a double car garage if it was unshielded. Now, of course, when we get it into our storage containers that keep it safe, it's going to take up a lot more space than that, but the volumes are actually quite manageable. Next slide. So that used nuclear fuel, we're developing detailed plans that outline our interim storage capacity that we'll build with the project, and that's a big part of the regulator focus. You need to have long-term sustainable waste management plans before the federal regulator will let you construct a nuclear facility. And that is right up to decommissioning. You have to show the regulator you have a full decommissioning plan for your site, which accounts for the waste products that you're going to generate at that site. And not only will they technically verify and check that plan is sound, they'll also make sure that it's fully funded. So you've actually got money in the bank to cover the cost associated with the decommissioning of the facility and all of the waste products that you're going to generate. It's something that before we even can construct a reactor, we'll have to demonstrate to the regulator that those systems are in place. So used nuclear fuel will come out of the reactor. This is very radioactive still when it comes out of the reactor, and it goes into a wet storage pool located on site for a period of about 7 to 10 years. It has to sit in wet storage until it's decayed enough that the temperature is more manageable. And once the temperature is manageable at that point, it's moved into a dry storage container. So these are 18 inches thick of concrete and rebar. The ones that manage used fuel in Canada today weigh about 70 tons when they're empty. So very substantial components. Once you get the used nuclear fuel into those dry storage containers and you seal it off, they then no longer pose any significant risk to people or the environment. And the used fuel can be stored in these containers for a very long period of time. And that's how it's worked in Canada for decades. Our nuclear power plants that have been operated for 50 years plus have been storing all of their waste products on site in canisters like that. And it's sustainable for the time period because it's such a dense form of energy that the waste products are not a huge volume, and it's manageable for nuclear power plants today to store them. There is a centralized plan to deal with waste in Canada, and if you caught our webinar last week, this was talked a lot about there. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization has a plan to centralize a repository for all of the used nuclear fuel in Canada. And they're going to do that with a reverse mine. So they're going to bury these canisters 500 to 800 meters below the surface, where you have the right geological conditions to store uranium byproduct like this. And so that project is active. They're looking for sites. They're focusing on 2 sites in Ontario right now for the first Deep Geological Repository, or DGR. And they hope to have the first one in operation by about the mid 2040s. And so our plan, and they have a mandate to take all the used fuel from SMR technologies that are built as well, and we're engaging with them regularly to talk about our project and how it fits into their mandate and long-term plan. It's important to note that the used fuel it's a solid material. Once it comes out of the reactor, it'll stay in that solid form and moved out of the wet storage into these dry canisters. We can go to the next slide, I think, Travis.
Hey, before I kick you to the next slide, Darcy, there's a couple questions that are filing in, and I think we're making okay on time, but a few came in specific to the fuel. And so first question was, will the uranium need to be sent to the US to be made usable? And so probably talking enrichment there.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the fuel, it is a uranium-based technology that we've selected, this BWRX 300, but it does require a low level of enrichment to the uranium before it can be processed into a fuel bundle suitable for this reactor. The supply chain is well established. It's the exact same fuel that goes into the larger reactors that are of the previous 9 generations of boiling water reactor that this represents. It's the same fuel form. It's called a GNF2 fuel. And so that same fuel that goes into the larger reactors will work for an SMR. It's just designed as a smaller package. But that enrichment process, Canada, we mine the uranium out of the ground and we do some processing for our existing CANDU fleet in Canada, but we don't enrich uranium in Canada. So the uranium will have to leave Saskatchewan, will have to leave Canada for part of that enrichment aspect of the fuel supply chain. And then once it's ready to be processed into once it's processed into a fuel bundle, it can come back and get loaded into our reactors here.
Perfect. One more fuel related question that popped off was about inquiring if the technology is caught up to be able to reuse that spent fuel yet.
Yeah, there's a lot of energy in the spent fuel that comes out of nuclear reactors, and that's all reactors. And so even with our CANDU fleet in Canada today, there's a technology that's being developed. These are considered more advanced SMR designs. They're a little bit later in the deployment schedule, but they're definitely in the works and in flight. And they reprocess used CANDU fuel from nuclear reactors in Canada today to get more energy out of that source and that waste product. So it's definitely something that's being considered, and SMRs could consider the same thing. I saw a question about the transportation risk, and transporting uranium materials or radioactive materials and waste products is a very important part of the project and something that's assessed very closely. Canada is what's called a tier 1 nuclear nation. So we mine uranium, we process that uranium into fuel. We have research reactors in Canada. We have power reactors operating all across the country. 15% of our electricity in Canada is nuclear powered today. And so with all of that activity, we also store and manage all our waste products that we generate from nuclear activities. And that could be, we produce a lot of medical isotopes, and we have R&D in the nuclear space at depth. And so the transportation aspect is a known commodity. Transport Canada has a lot of requirements and regulations on moving radioactive materials around the country safely and securely. And we have a strong history of doing it. But definitely an important part of how you site and how you consider developing the project is that transportation aspect.
Perfect. Thanks for that. One more fuel, and then we're going to move on to onto the water slides next. But it's we talked a little bit about enriched fuel. So how does that enriched fuel compare to the raw ore?
Yeah. So the raw uranium has about 0.7% of the specific isotope that you use to produce power. And when you enrich it, you increase that percentage. So you're basically concentrating the fuel, and the isotope that you need out of the fuel, you're concentrating it. Our reactor requires a very low level of enrichment. It's 4.95%, but it is enriched nonetheless. And so anything there's international agreements that show anything less than 20% enrichment is considered a low level of enrichment. And we're at the 4.95% for the BWRX 300.
Thanks. Okay, let's move forward. Thanks, Darcy.
Yeah, so water is something really important to us in Saskatchewan, and it's a limited commodity in Saskatchewan, and we definitely appreciate that when we look at our technologies and our ways of producing electricity. But it is a boiling water reactor, and with any large thermal plant, you need a cooling source to reject a lot of the low-grade heat once you've converted all the energy you can into electricity. But it's important to know that there's two distinct systems here. So one is a closed loop system that produces the power. So this is the water that goes through the reactor and picks up the heat from that reactor, and then goes through a steam turbine to produce electricity. And that just goes back and forth in a closed loop fashion. I think the next slide has a little bit more information on that. And it's very separate from our cooling system. So the cooling system is used to reject heat that we condense that steam back into water, basically, once it's gone through the steam turbine. And this is similar to how we operate our coal-fired plants or our combined cycle gas facilities. The Queen Elizabeth Power Station uses the South Saskatchewan River as a cooling means in the exact same way that a nuclear power plant would. So it's really important to know that we use physical separation to keep the cooling water away from the reactor operations. They are physically separated, and we ensure that there's no contamination that way. And this is the same principle that large boiling water reactors operate today. And a lot of our, like I mentioned, our large thermal power plants operate the same way too. There are two ways you can develop and design a cooling system to work with that process. So one is cooling towers, and one is with what's called once through cooling with a water body. So if you have a large reservoir, a large lake, you can just borrow water from that lake or reservoir, run it through a condenser, and you add heat to it, heat only, and then you return that water to the reservoir at a higher temperature. And ultimately, that's going to use less water. If you operate a cooling tower, you still need to draw water in, but what you're doing is you're evaporating water to reject that heat. And then it's more of a consumptive use. So you don't take as much water, but you're consuming it through evaporation to cool the process. And so those options A and kind of option B on how you cool the process is still a decision we have to make on our project. Typically with large thermal power plants, the most efficient way of doing it is with once through cooling. And within Saskatchewan, we're very concerned with water availability and sustainability long term. We have lots of irrigation plans with the Diefenbaker system, and the Estevan reservoirs are of limited quantity as well with the Souris water system that feeds them. And so we want to look after that water, and that's going to pointing us towards once through cooling as the likely technology for the cooling, but that's a decision to come on the project still. So that steam cycle where you're generating the steam and running it through a steam turbine, that's good. That's something very common to us at SaskPower. It's the same principle we use with our coal-fired boilers, our combined cycle natural gas plants, but it's just the way you develop the thermal energy to create the steam with the reaction, with a nuclear fission reaction, is very new to us. And so it's a lot of development of the ways we do business to ensure nuclear safety and understand the principles of safety and quality that go into a construction of this type of project. We're developing a lot of those programs right now to enable a qualified project activity under the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So this last slide is, and then I'll turn it over to Sarah, is just our overall timeline for the project.
No, I'm not going to advance you, Darcy. I'm going to keep you on water for one quick second. I'm just distracted by all the questions flooding in here. And so there's a couple specific to water. I think I lost it. So how much water is required for cooling? And the question is goes on to talk about, in the case of severe drought, would that require the reactor to shut down, as we saw reactors in France had to last summer?
Yeah, so the water availability and sustainability long term is something we measure and look at and evaluate in terms of our project. But our impact on the water is really dependent on the characteristics of the water body that we're interacting with. And so when you think about Lake Diefenbaker, like it's a similar type of operation as the large nuclear power plants that operate on the Great Lakes in Ontario today. And so these take water, and those water bodies are so big they can reject a lot of heat without having much impact. So you take cold water from the bottom of the lake, and then by the time you heat it up and return it to the surface, you're returning it to the surface at a similar temperature that already exists at the surface. And so that water body actually doesn't see a lot of impact associated with that operation. That's a lot different when we look at our Estevan water bodies. The Boundary Dam Reservoir, where we operate 900 megawatts of coal on that reservoir today. We have a much more larger impact because the body of water is smaller. So we're actually heating up the whole body of water, and we're causing it to lose more water every year due to forced evaporation associated with that heat that we're putting in. And so that is a loss on the water body that you can measure. And it's something very different if we go to Boundary Dam or if we look at Lake Diefenbaker. Lake Diefenbaker is so big and deep, the water is a lot colder at the bottom. Our impact is going to be a lot less. So the amount of water that you would allocate due to losses associated with forced evaporation of the cooling system is very dependent on the water body itself. So you can't really say this is the allocation of water we're going to need. It depends on where you site the facility and what that water body looks like.
No, thanks for that. To stay on that topic, there's a few questions in here that point to or asking about like that long-term availability. So knowing that, like Diefenbaker is glacier fed, and we are talking about climate change and climate change policies. And so if you're looking at that long-term 30+ year planning, how does that water availability, how sure are we that we'll have that water to use?
Yeah, we're thinking 60 years, right? That's our operational life. And so we're doing assessments as part of the impact assessment. We'll be doing detailed assessments of long-term availability of water supplies. And these include factors like climate change, licensed allocation, stress on the water body from other industrial uses, those types of things. And so it's something that we carefully measure, and we make sure that long-term sustainability is there. The Estevan water bodies, we've operated our coal plants on there for decades, so we're very familiar with the availability there, and we're comfortable with the operation. Diefenbaker would be something new, but Diefenbaker is also so big that we're not going to cause a lot of losses on the water system associated with our operation. It's going to be pretty negligible. That's what we're expecting to find out, but we have to do the work to characterize the water bodies and then analyze what our potential impact is going to be. And so that work is undergoing right now. We're building thermal models. We're collecting field data to understand how the water moves exactly and what the temperature profiles are top to bottom, so that those impacts can then be assessed.
Perfect. Now, is it safe to say that a 300 megawatt SMR will require less or similar water allocation compared to the existing like coal-fired units we see on Boundary Dam, for example?
Yeah, it's a little bit more is what we're expecting on a per megawatt basis. So nuclear power is it's rule of thumb is it's about 15% more cooling compared to a standard coal-fired operation, and that's mostly because you're not losing a lot of heat to a stack. Right, it's all contained within the reactor building, and so those, we have 900 megawatts of coal, or we had in our prime day, we had 900 megawatts of coal operating on Boundary Dam, and we can compare that to what we're planning, which would be 600 megawatts of nuclear in that region, and then we will have a very comfortable idea of water requirements and usages and availability.
Thanks. Okay, I have a bunch more water questions coming in. We're going to put a pin in those, and we'll come back. Let's flip back to the slide deck here for a moment. Oops,
Okay,
not
yeah.
too far.
So this is the overall timeline for development of a first SMR project in Saskatchewan, and it's a long one. We get challenged a lot in terms of we're getting ready to phase out conventional coal. Why can't we move faster with the nuclear project? And this is the about as quickly as we can go to develop plans and prove to the regulators that we've got sustainable long-term plans for that address nuclear safety and security associated with deploying an SMR in Saskatchewan. It takes a lot of time to develop that and a lot of investment at the same time. So we've got a technology. We're in a site evaluation mode, which Sarah will run everyone through right away here, and that will allow us to enter the regulatory processes. So we'll have to do a full federal impact assessment, and that's a 5-year process once you start it. And we'll be looking to clear that process around the end of this decade. So 2029, we hope to have a site that is licensed that we could start to prepare for this type of technology. And we'll make our decision on whether we proceed with that construction phase or not at that time. So everything we're doing now is set up to inform a decision whether or not to construct by 2029. And if we decide to construct, we could be in operation with the first reactor, which would be just 300 megawatts of nuclear power by the mid 2030s. So a very small chunk of our grid at the time would be that first unit, but it is something that we could build this machine that could start selecting second sites or third sites and start getting into the licensing of those sites in a parallel fashion, so that once you do have one in service in 2035, we could continue to roll out the technology and build it out to provide more electricity in Saskatchewan in a faster fashion after that. One last comment I'll make here is just a really important note. The impact assessment process that we're planning for, we're going to go through it for 2 reactors at the first site. So we're going to license the site and assess the impacts for 2 reactors, even though we'll only pull the trigger on the first one likely in 2029. But then we could pull the trigger on the second reactor without having to repeat all of the impact assessment work for that site.
Yeah, thanks, Stars. Now, while we're still on this slide, I think you touched on some of this, but we got a couple questions specific to, like just like as you pointed out, why are we taking so long, and how many are we planning to build?
Yeah, it takes time. We're a greenfield jurisdiction, and so the process, the federal impact assessment process, is lengthy, and it is designed to ensure that projects are built within the best interest of everyone in those regional jurisdictions. And so, but it takes time to qualify our business and our project activity for a nuclear project, and developing and investing in those business processes and the programs that deliver nuclear power in a safe and secure way is what we're doing now. So we have to stand up and set up those business processes before we can really qualify and get into nuclear licensing. And so that's what we're doing now, at the same time as we're progressing the site evaluation and planning for that impact assessment and the other licensing that we'll need from the CNSC. So it takes time, but there is an initial investment that could allow for second projects to follow in a faster timeline, and you can start to phase things and do things in parallel to shorten timelines on future projects. It's definitely an option.
Okay, so looking at this schedule, and knowing you're a project manager, probably losing sleep over being able to keep this schedule. We got a question in here about, what's the biggest risk that it would impact the schedule?
Oh, that's a good one. I think there's 2 things that come to mind there. We're the first greenfield deployment of a nuclear project in Canada in about 40 years. So OPG is developing a brownfield site with the first SMR technology demonstration, but we're the first greenfield. And they've already gone through their federal impact assessment for that site. And so the Impact Assessment Agency has new legislation that was issued in 2019, and they redesigned the impact assessment process at that time. And it's also with a nuclear project, the CNSC is going to come together with the Impact Assessment Agency to form an integrated review panel. And that will be the panel that makes the recommendation on our project. And that's new process. So new regulatory process like this is a risk to us. And we're in this pre-planning mode with the regulators to make sure that this process is very well understood by us as a proponent, by all the parties that come together to play a role in the regulator process, and then it can be communicated to the public very clearly. And as those hearings are scheduled and roll out through the impact assessment process, it's all very clear, well thought out, and well planned to mitigate that risk. The other one, and I saw some questions about the number of BWRX-300s that are being deployed in the US, in Ontario, that we're considering, and Poland has announced a very aggressive plan with this technology. It's supply chain, finding the people, goods, and services to deliver mega construction projects like these SMRs is going to be a challenge. And so a big part of what we're doing is preparing early with the technology in mind to understand the supply chain requirements and look at labor market opinions and where things are at in Western Canada or North America to deliver the construction phases that we're thinking about delivering with nuclear power. So.
Right. Oh, good answers. Okay, let's get over to, as you coined it, the fun section, and we'll turn it over to Sarah to talk about the site selection process.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. So now that Darcy has introduced SMRs and some of the key considerations, we'll get into talking about the site selection process. Next slide. So as that last timeline slide showed from Darcy, our goal is to have a site selected and recommended for development by the end of 2024. To get there, we have been evaluating potential siting areas in more detail while we gather data and engage with communities. A very important aspect of the siting process is to gather information about what matters to municipalities, residents, stakeholders, and rights holders. We're using a number of ways to ensure leaders and residents are well informed and have a voice in the siting process. We've had numerous drop-in events and have hosted in-person and virtual meetings for those close to and within the siting areas. Our siting decision for the project has the potential to adversely impact treaty and Aboriginal rights. For this reason, SaskPower has a duty to consult and accommodate potentially impacted First Nations and Métis locals. SaskPower triggered the duty to consult and has contacted those who are located near the study areas or known to exercise rights in and around those areas. And that consultation will focus on how rights are exercised in proposed regions that the siting will avoid and mitigate potential adverse impacts. Our siting process, which we'll explain in more detail in a couple slides, will ultimately help us identify 2 sites to take forward for detailed study by the end of this year, and then with the final site recommended by the end of 2024. One of the first steps towards being able to identify and recommend preferred siting areas relates to selecting the technology and understanding the technical requirements. SaskPower went through a technical evaluation, and as Darcy mentioned, we selected the GE Hitachi BWRX-300, which we announced last June. The technical requirements for any specific facility can have an influence on locations that best support the project. For example, in our case, as Darcy had mentioned, access to water for cooling is important. We also need to consider Canada's nuclear regulations and standards, as well as SaskPower's business considerations. When we identify the risks and understand the technical requirements of the technology, we can identify key siting or key technical siting considerations required for the project. The second step is where we start to really look at all the types of information needed to complete a robust evaluation for identifying those suitable siting areas that meet not only the technical criteria, but social, cultural, and environmental requirements. This process included identifying over 50 relevant siting criteria, which were grouped into the 3 themes you see here. So there's technical, social, cultural, and environmental. We also pulled together spatial regional data for each siting criterion. So basically, we have a map showing how each criterion or indicator influences a specific area. We've pulled together an indicator workbook, which is a catalog of all the criteria that has been considered. Each criterion or indicator is described in detail, mapped, and given a weight of importance. And so when we pull together the layers of spatial information with consideration to their importance, the output is a map of suitability, which we'll get into later on, or you may have seen on our website already. The software that we've used to aid us with this is called GoldSet, which is the decision support tool that helps us characterize the data in such a way that the information is easily understood and documented. So I think we've got a little poll here just to find out where everyone is from. Let us know if you're within our Estevan siting area, the Elbow siting area, or if you're calling in or viewing from another alternative Saskatchewan location or outside of Saskatchewan. Or feel free to let us know. I don't know if there's I can't see the polls, Travis. So I don't know if it's a poll or if you're going to go in
no
the
other.
chat.
Yeah, you got to pick one of those 4 buttons. So in that Estevan area, in the Elbow area, in Saskatchewan, or outside Saskatchewan. Like I said, we spent a lot of time within those couple regions, and this is our opportunity to reach other folks. We're just curious about who we're able to capture here today. I think we'll give that half a minute. I think I'll get the results popped up once it's done. Okay, most folks, 81%, are in Saskatchewan, but outside of those Estevan and Elbow areas. Interestingly enough, we have about 10% of folks from outside Saskatchewan, and we have almost 10% combined from within the Estevan and Elbow area. So we really are reaching those folks outside of those geographic areas that we've been popping around in the last month.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, let's hit that next slide.
So as most are aware, through our technical assessment, or if you didn't know, we had identified and selected 2 areas for further study in the province, which we've continued to evaluate. So we've termed these areas as the Estevan and Elbow study areas. When we talk about the Estevan siting area, we're talking about a 10-kilometer radius around the Rafferty and Boundary Dam reservoirs and the area around Almeida or Grant Divine. The Elbow siting area is focused on a 10-kilometer radius around the Thompson and Gordon Mackenzie arms of Lake Diefenbaker. This step 3 represents the output of the suitability analysis. We can use our siting criteria and indicators to show patches of higher or lower overall suitability within our siting areas, and then from there we'll be able to identify high potential suitable patches of lands for candidate sites within those siting areas. On to the next slide. So I thought I'd walk through a few of our indicators to give folks on the call look into how we framed the indicators and criteria within that indicator workbook. Again, there were over 50 initially. The indicator workbooks are on the SaskPower website and are available to take a look through. There are 2 versions posted now. The first version we have shows SaskPower's starting point. And the second version is an update based on community feedback and learnings and some of our technical studies. There is a workbook specific to each area where the graphics are a bit clear if you're having trouble seeing study areas here today. So moving on, this indicator is discussing managed lands, which falls under our environmental theme. And our intent here is to minimize encroachment. We identify the source. So you see there's a source there with reference where the spatial data comes from. Here it comes from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment. The layer pre-processing and comments references any GIS processing steps that were involved with that data set. We have identified here that a buffer has not been added. The description gives an explanation or additional information on the indicator itself. And so here it kind of talks to give you more information on what managed lands are, or where those, what falls within that definition. Each indicator has a map where you can see the areas of suitability based on the data set. And then there's a legend there. So the green areas are where managed lands are not present, and while the red areas depict where they are. And the weight that we've given this is a 50. To the next one. So an example of one of our social cultural criteria is proximity to workforce, which is a big one. We prefer sites within 100 kilometers of settlements greater than 2,000 people. In this one, we've incorporated a distance decay buffer from 0 to 100 kilometers. So the longer the travel time, the lower the suitability. Interestingly, SaskPower initially started off with stating that we preferred sites within 75 kilometers. We heard lots of feedback from folks within these siting areas that they travel longer distances presently to get to work, and we were asked to bump this up to 100 kilometers. So we reflected that change, and we've weighted this indicator as 100. And so then I did see in the chat there is a question in regards to emergency services. So I just wanted to point out, so what this is attractive. Population centers greater than 2,000 people provide a localized workforce and access to emergency services. So those hospital, fire, police, and EMS. So one of the site selection process, we do look at the existing services within those communities, and then look at where that can help supplement the project, but where they fall short as well. And so determining, what is needed to be built up for our facility. And I think the question asked of whether or not emergency services would be on site, and the assumption is yes, they would be. But that is we're going through that assessment right now. On to the next one. An example of a technical indicator. So here we've identified we should be avoiding siting on high pressure hydrocarbon and water pipelines. We've made it an exclusion and added a 500-meter buffer. So the exclusion is kind of the highest ranking possible, and I think it makes sense that we wouldn't want to be siting on those high pressure gas lines. On to the next one. Superficial geology. So another example of a technical indicator. Here we've identified the importance of having a geotechnical stable location, and we've given this indicator a weight of 100 given its significance. And so our technical experts have weighed in to score those superficial geology types to determine which areas are lower suitability versus the having higher suitability. So water sources proximity. So another example of the technical indicator, we've identified the importance of having a site closer to a water body. So within 3 kilometers, and we started off with that 10-kilometer distance when we studied the entire siting area. Being within 3 kilometers is considered higher suitability. So the closer you are to the water, the better the economics with transporting that water. And the further away from that 3-kilometer mark, the lower the suitability and higher the costs associated with that. And we've also weighted this at 100 for the project. So step 4, engagement. So today you'll be seeing the results of step 3, the suitability analysis, and 4 today in the revised suitability maps with all the green shading. We've published the first suitability map in January. So if you had signed up for our newsletters, you would have received a link to this map. It was also posted on our website. We collected feedback on all the indicators that created the map through a separate engagement process we've developed called the regional evaluation process. Essentially, each study area is represented by a committee with community representatives from Indigenous organizations, research and academia, industry, and non-government organizations. We were able to capture over 180 comments on our indicators. The map you see today includes the input from those regional representatives. And for those interested, all the materials were distributed through the regional evaluation process are on our webpage. The REP is concluding. We've had 3 workshops so far. We have our 4th workshop in here near the end of May. All finalized documents are expected to be posted by mid to late June. So we'll start off with the revised suitability map for Elbow. So areas with shades of green represent land that appear to be highly suitable compared to other areas within the boundary. The darker the green, the more suitable the land. Relative to the green areas, white areas have a lower suitability than 70%, or are not suitable and have been excluded. So like those pipelines or land within municipal boundaries. So one of the comments to us was to try to be to have a 1 kilometer buffer from that community to allow for future urban development. The areas circled in the black marked areas, they appear to be both highly suitable based on our regional analysis, and they have suitable shoreline, a suitable shoreline for cooling water intake locations. This doesn't mean that areas outside of the black are no longer being considered or evaluated. It just means that the areas within the black is where we will prioritize to search for potential sites at this time. The dotted line depicts where there is an existing asset where further analysis is required to determine whether a co-location is a possibility for the area. And so that's where our hydroelectric station is specifically on that map. The same spiel continues for Estevan. You'll notice that there are no intake locations highlighted for the Grant Devine Almeida area. That's just because we're focusing on the Rafferty boundary areas at this time. And then you'll see that just that point out that dotted line is around the existing Boundary Dam site that we have, whole facility there. So we'll be looking at the existing asset and determining whether or not there's any synergies that could be used. On to step 5. So combining the suitability analysis with the information we received through technical studies, we are now getting ready to start step 5, where we'll identify possible or candidate sites. And so to do this, we are refining our criteria as we move from that regional level analysis to a local level. The next few slides, but I think Travis is we're gonna swap off, and Travis will go through an activity with you. We'll highlight some of the local criteria that we'll use to score possible sites. So I'll hand it off to you, Travis, and
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah.
Hey, before I take it over and jump into our activity, I have 2 site criteria related questions that popped up. Well, one was just about siting near the U.S. border, and the question was, are we anticipating any pushback in that Estevan region from being so close to the U.S. border?
It is a criteria that we have considered right now. We see it as it's just something that we're observing at this point in time. And once we have a site, we'll be able to engage more on what the potential issues could be with us being sited to that U.S. boundary.
Perfect. And the other one is related to, the existing distribution lines they have noted here. So is that infrastructure adequate to handle one or two possible SMRs?
So we have done an exploratory assessment, and we will need a dedicated line for each SMR. So a new dedicated line for each SMR which will be, depending on the area, will be, routed back to a switching station, and we, factor in, system impact, reinforcement, things that are required for that as well.
Okay.
But yes, it
Do
is
we-
on our radar. We'll know more once we actually have those candidate sites to determine what it means for those locations.
Okay, so would we know yet about what those poles or standards would look like, or is that once we have a site specific related?
This would be a 230 kV line of what you typically see for our existing combined cycle gas plants.
Okay, wait, I'm gonna jump into our activity. We're doing okay on time, but we're gonna cut it close. Okay, so as Sarah walked through, I think she walked through those 5 steps in that siting process. First we select that technology, so we have an understanding what the machine needs. We did a whole bunch of work to go from, to identify those 2 regions we wanted to look into, identify potential sites, and we'd have confidence we'd be able to find the site within. We did that suitability level analysis to prioritize those areas and to find some areas of higher probability, higher suitability within the regions. And now we're starting to make that shift of finding individual sites. And so we'll go from, identifying a number of potential sites rather shortly. We'll get down to a handful of sites, and then eventually, as Sarah pointed out, we're going to have 2 candidate sites by the end of this year. And what's up on the screen now are the themes in which we'll compare all those sites against each other. So we'll look at potential site A and potential site B and potential site C, and we'll look at it through these 4 themes and these lenses, and we'll essentially score them all. And that's the method we'll use to just keep the best of the best and walk away with our top 2 candidate sites. And so when we score, like we'll look at that safety and technical criteria, and we'll score that site on, what's its access to emergency services look like. So where is that nearest fire hall? Where is that nearest hospital? Where is the nearest police station? Stuff like that. It's how that specific site would be interacting with, something that's potentially hazardous or of that industrial use. So Sarah talked about the pipeline, high pressure gas pipeline. So is the site really close to a high pressure gas pipeline or something else that's potentially hazardous to, our staff or the facility? We also talked about some of those technical things. Is this, from an engineering and perspective, a nice, stable, suitable tract of land to construct and build something on, right? From that technical and safety lens, all these sites will get a score. We will also score all those sites through that economic lens. And so you can compare, these, I like to look at these as a bunch of solvable problems, but solvable problems that cost a little bit of money. So if we're, for example, really far away from the lake, we have to lift and move that water to get to the facility. So we can do that, but that comes at a cost, right? If there's no, depending on what that road infrastructure looks like, well, we might have to build some new roads or upgrade some roads. Technically possible, but it comes at a cost. Looking at your grid infrastructure. So where do we have to connect this to the transmission line? We build transmission lines all the time, but depending on site A and site B and site C, we might be building more or less transmission lines. So again, that's something we can do, but it comes at a cost. And so we can compare all these sites through an economic lens and have that understanding of, if we choose site A over site B, is it more or less money it comes down to? We'll also look at them through an environmental lens. And so again, you'll have, if we're going to pick site A, is that going to impact a critical habitat or a wetland or impact the parklands or something like that? So we'll look at sites A, B, and C. We'll give them an environmental score. And then lastly, we'll look at them through this social and cultural lens. And again, this is just a high level summary of what these are. And so, is that site going to impact, something that has some culturally sensitive areas or something of significance, or a cemetery? Some of this is about how we integrate into the community. And so Sarah talked about that 1 kilometer buffer around the town. So that town or village has room to grow. We also look at trying to get close to those towns. There's a bit of a Goldilocks there. You want to be close, but not too close. We do look at things like what's the commute times going to look like for our workforce and the staff that's there. You know, is that neighboring town? What's the quality of life going to be like? Is there a school there? Is there a grocery store there? Is there, you know, all those essential services that you need to attract and retain kind of staff? So we'll look at those sites and we'll score them through a social lens as well. And then what we're hoping we'll end up with, because of all that early work we did and that level of analysis, is a bunch of really, really good sites. And this is an activity we've been doing out in the communities, is asking folks to rank those or tell us what your priorities are. And so if we're making decisions between sites A and sites B and site C, like I said, those are all really, really important things, and we just want to be left with the best of the best. And so we'll have to meet a certain threshold of all 4 of those activities. But when we choose a site, we want to make that decision eyes wide open, and we want to understand what your priorities are. And so if you had to rank these, and this, you know, we've been asking folks just for a simple 1, 2, 3 ranking, or if these are all equally important, say these are all number ones, and to tell us why. And so we have some better understanding of what your priorities are and why they are. And when we're making decisions, we can make decisions eyes wide open. So I think this is our last polling activity that we have. And Anna or Michelle, if you're able to launch that, please do. I don't see it up yet, but I'm hoping it's going to pop up. Oh, maybe we're stuck on this poll. Okay, no, looks like the poll is live and answers are coming in. I just don't see it. Maybe because I'm a panelist and not an attendee. They don't want to know my thoughts. Okay, we'll give it a few minutes. Just to get your again, put your rankings in there. That should be the first question that comes up. Is we'll be asking for your ranking. Again, they should be able to put all number ones, or a simple 1, 2, 3, 1 being the most important in your heart, and then to tell us why. Those were high level summaries of what's in those indicators. You know, as Sarah identified earlier, there's 50 some different indicators, and this is just how we kind of lump some of them together. I'll give it a little bit more time. Looks like we have a few of the answers coming in, but I know we asked for some qualitative answers there too, so it might take you a little bit more time to give some thought to those and write them out. And what we've been seeing so far in the communities is people have been giving some careful thought. There's been some really good answers and some really thoughtful responses in the when we went out in the community so far. And then we're going to save the rest of our time. We only got about 15-20 minutes left, and we're just going to run into the Q&A. And so let's maybe switch gears to that so we can get through as many questions as possible. Before I forget, I do want to plug in that we have 2 more of these talks coming up. So Darcy and I both mentioned at the top of the hour that there's one tomorrow. It's on large scale renewables, and then there's one next week on May 10th. These are both the same time slot, this 12 to 1:30, and that one on the 10th is going to be about looking at a whole bunch of other supply options. Okay, maybe what I'll do is I will stop sharing. I'm going to pull up the rest of the questions, and we'll see how many we can get. We'll go through as many as we can, but we have a few hundred people in the room, and so we might not get to them all. Okay, Darcy, let's maybe jump back to that timeline and some of the process stuff. And so the first question comes up here. Someone pointed out the federal government soon to introduce the clean energy regulations, pointing to net zero electricity grid by 2035. And so, what are your thoughts around that being the target date that we should be planning to?
Yeah, the clean electricity standards are something being proposed by the federal government right now. They're expected to go through review and be gazetted sometime in the near future, but that would place additional stress on our supply planning, and it may limit our ability to use some of the natural gas assets that we're planning to use right now into the 2030s. So what that means for Saskatchewan and what net zero by 2035 means within those regulations is still something we're working very closely with the federal government on, but it may put additional pressure on the supply plan and decision process for sure. It's definitely on our radar and something we're tracking and planning for closely.
Thanks. So when you think about that decision in 2029 that you mentioned about, that's going to be the time where we essentially have a shovel-ready project. We can say we're going to go or no go. What's the biggest factors in that decision? Is it going to be up-to-date cost comparative modeling, or is it going to be about or cost comparative against other non-emitting options, or is it going to be public support? How do we look at that decision?
Yeah, cost is a big factor. We really appreciate that our rates drive the livelihood of our customers and their ability to stay competitive with various industrial processes and businesses in Saskatchewan. So cost is a huge factor, and we look at levelized cost of electricity. So we take the capital expense to build it, and we look at all the operating and maintenance costs. And then definitely a decommissioning and waste management is a big part rolled into and regulated as part of the nuclear life cycle. So that all gets rolled up into a cost of electricity over the life cycle of that plant. And then we'll compare that to other options we have available to meet our supply needs in Saskatchewan, given the regulatory framework and our objectives for sustainable electricity power supplies. So sustainable is environment, right? What are our CO2 emissions profile and how nuclear is going to be used into that situation. Environmental effects are socioeconomic effects. Those are all factored into those decisions. So it's definitely, they're based off of feedback, and we want to develop that through the Future of Power engagement program that we're in right now, and making sure that we're making the very well-informed decisions and they're representative of the values and people that are in Saskatchewan.
Hey, thanks. Now there was a question about, and I don't know if we might have touched on this already, but are there any SMRs in Canada or elsewhere operating, and are we looking at other SMR technologies other than the GE Hitachi? I think you could answer those two.
Yeah. So there are no SMRs operating in Canada today. We have research reactors. We have very small operations along those lines. I mean, we had one at the U of S. There was a research reactor, a slowpoke reactor that operated there for 40 years, from 81 to 2019, until it was decommissioned just recently. But SMRs aren't in operation today. So Ontario is looking at deploying Canada's first SMR, and their project at an existing nuclear site just outside of Toronto is very actively being developed. And we work really closely with them on that project. They're looking at an in-service date by 2028, and they've selected the exact same technology as us, this BWRX-300. So that project is going to be a big risk mitigation factor for our project, having it demonstrated to the Canadian regulator and have it in service before we make our construction decision is the plan. Other reactors are on the radar. We've selected this reactor as a first deployment with a focus on clean electricity in Saskatchewan. And it's it was based on many factors in terms of technology readiness and where we needed clean electricity. But when you think about Saskatchewan needs to decarbonize, there are other advanced reactors that we are looking at to serve other unique needs in Saskatchewan. We can consider cogeneration applications with heavy industry, where they need high temperature clean steam, and we can use any surplus electricity into the grid. And there's other reactors that may be better suited for those types of applications than the BWRX 300. So we have a process stood up to consider that and continuing to evaluate more advanced reactors and their potential business case in Saskatchewan too.
Yeah, I have a couple more cost related questions. So one's, saying that, like, looking at the cost here, is the cost per SMR realistic to replace coal and gas, considering that how much we would require for, if you're looking to replace coal and gas, someone did the math and said, we're going to need 10 of these to replace our and keep up with our existing load. And tied to that question, there's another one. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about just the difference between the actual capital cost of that project and the consumer price, right? So would that large capital investment in SMRs drive lower prices, or what does that look like? We talk about, like I said, it's a big capital cost up front, but what's the actual price look like?
Yeah, I mean, our current cost of electricity coming out of our existing coal plants, to say, represents a pretty cheap way of producing power. But those power plants are getting old. And I mean, to substantially extend their life, there would be significant reinvestment required. And so though, like, if we were to build a brand new coal plant and compare that to an SMR, I really don't know what those numbers are, because it's not really something we're considering from a greenfield deployment standpoint. But I mean, our cost of electricity, as the carbon tax increases through the 2020s, is going to go up. And we need to find other ways of producing electricity that don't have that GHG, greenhouse gas emission price tag. And that's what nuclear power represents. So, I mean, a lot more work needs to go into assessing the cost of energy out of a nuclear facility relative to what other options we might have that are lower or zero emitting. But it has to be cost competitive. I don't view it as we get questions about, well, how much is nuclear power going to increase our rates? It's more of a question is how well can nuclear power maintain our rates and keep them from having to go up too much as we transition away from just burning the coal that we have or natural gas. Natural gas has a lot of high variability in the cost of fuel, and we've seen natural gas prices spike, and putting too many eggs into that basket can be a little bit dangerous in terms of sustainable and cost-effective power for Saskatchewan. So it's about finding that right mix of energy sources that produce reliable and sustainable and most important, and well, not most importantly, but equally importantly, cost-effective power, right? That's the thing with us, as we're a very regulated electricity market in Saskatchewan, and so it gives us the ability to take a nuclear project, which is very capital intense, and spread that capital cost over a long, reliable life, and with a reasonable cost of electricity. And so other markets that aren't regulated have a more difficult time doing that, because they're looking for returns on that capital investment that are a lot shorter than the way SaskPower can look at it. And that's really an enabling factor for nuclear power. And we want to build off that advantage we have in Saskatchewan to utilize this potential energy source for clean electricity, clean industrial energy, and support those markets. And so that kind of speaks into how we look at the cost of energy, right? It's spread over the whole lifetime. We think about decommissioning, waste management, operating maintenance costs. The overnight capital, of course, is a big one. And then you put all of those into a financial model, and it gives you a cost per unit of energy. And so we're building all of the the cost model is established, and we need to build and understand all of the inputs so that we can make a very informed decision on cost, right?
So we're getting short on time. I want to try to get to maybe 3 or 4 questions. We're going to jump through themes here. So I see one on fuel waste safety. We're going to spread around. So first on safety here. So are there emergency measures in place for an evacuation of a large population in the event of a major accident? So you speak to that a little bit, Darce?
Yeah, it's a good one. So nuclear safety is paramount when you're developing this type of project. And the way nuclear safety works is it's defense in depth. So there are a number of systems that keep the operation safe and keep the operation under control in several different situations. And then if abnormal conditions pop up, there's systems on top of systems that will shut down the reaction or maintain the cooling on the reactor in a safe state. But ultimately, your last line of defense is an emergency preparedness plan. That could mean evacuation. Conventional reactors have emergency plans that have a footprint in the 10 to 15 kilometer range, I think. That's how some of our CANDU reactors operate. With the SMRs, they're, because of the smaller nature and the potential impact of a worst case scenario accident, they're suggesting that emergency planning could be the fence line of the power plant. That means you have someone living just outside that fence line, and you could have a catastrophic issue with the power plant, and that person wouldn't even have to be notified. Now, that has to be a lot of effort to go into demonstrating and proving that, and I think it's going to end up being a little bit of a larger zone than the plant fence, but we'll see. So ultimately, emergency response plans are a last line of defense, and that'll be built into the operation of our facility too.
Yeah, on that same thread, so you talked a little bit about the difference, like, of the existing CANDU fleet from a safety zone perspective. Someone specifically asked, like, are there other benefits in choosing the GE Hitachi versus the CANDU reactor?
CANDUs are conventional large reactors today. CANDU does have an SMR design, and it was actually evaluated as part of our technology evaluation process. But the technology readiness wasn't quite there compared with some of the other technologies that were up there. So the CANDU conventional design is something we looked at for decades at SaskPower, and that's in large range. It's about 950 megawatts with a single reactor, and that makes it tough to tie into our grid. That would represent 1/5 of our grid today. And so the amount of backup power that you need to have in place in case that unit needs to come offline for whatever reason just makes it uneconomical for us. So that's the reason we don't have CANDUs operating in Saskatchewan today for the most part, but SMRs are changing that narrative for nuclear power.
All right, to switch gears, I got a question about the life cycle of that reactor and decommissioning specifically. So after the reactor is decommissioned, how long is the reactor structure and building expected to remain until it's completely decommissioned and demolished?
Yeah, that I don't think we have specific dates in mind. The initial plans would have a decommissioning period that would immediately follow operation. So your decommissioning plan, which is how you're going to deconstruct that facility, and then what you're going to do with all of the intermediate, low, intermediate, and high level waste components that would result as the decommissioning, is all laid out at the time when we submit our construction license. So you need to have a plan in terms of how you're going to decommission it, and it has to be fully funded before you start any construction of a nuclear power plant in Canada. And the CNSC looks after that. The specific timing, our model would show us decommissioning immediately after a 60-year operating life. But you can look at reinvesting in the power plant and maybe getting an extension on your 60-year life with a capital investment down the road, similar to how the CANDU reactors are being refurbished in Canada right now.
I'm gonna try to get one more in here before we run out of time, and it's related to to water, and the person here is asking, what's the maximum distance that the cooling pond or tower can be from the reactor itself? So what, do we have a setback from the water body?
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think for our suitability analysis, I think we've said 50 meters, right? We have that distance of 50 meters from that water body.
Oh, the
Yeah.
maximum distance.
Oh, the
I
maximum.
can answer this.
Sorry, the maximum distance. I think this maximum distance is dictated by the cost, really, right? And so we've got, we've said 3 kilometers probably where we want to stay. Just because anything further than that is quite costly. Even at that 3 kilometer distance, it's pretty far and it has impacts on our cost. But we've opened ourselves to that 3 kilometers just because we know that there's things that are within those intake areas that may drive you away or have limitations where you can't site the plant. And so we don't want to box ourselves in too early. And so that's why we've opened it up, but definitely being as close as possible is better from an economic standpoint.
Okay, thanks. I have more questions, but unfortunately we're running out of time. I will note that, Sarah, Darcy, and I, we're going to come back here for, I think we're 6:30 to 8. Where the presentation will largely be the same, but we'll hopefully be able to take on some new questions. We also share information on our project page all the time. So saspower.com/nuclear. We share a lot of information. We are trying to be fairly transparent with this project. As Sarah mentioned, all the materials we're sharing through that regional evaluation process, we post those. And so there's lots of slide decks and materials available there. We also have our engagement hub. So that's saspower.com/engage. So you can sign up and follow more webinars and activities like this, and reach out and interact with us through those forums. So we're going to sign off for now. I thank you all for spending 90 minutes with us and taking an interest in asking some questions. I appreciate your time.